I'll give you a moment to connect to sound. Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 1137th New Social Environment. I'm Chloe Stagaman, Director of Programs here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Suzanne Ramljak, Jed Morse, Christopher Lyon, and Phyllis Tuchman on the occasion of David Smith, The Nature of Sculpture. And now I'll introduce today's guests and host. Suzanne Ramljak is Vice President of Collections and Curatorial Affairs at Frederick Meyer Gardens and Sculpture Park, where she curated David Smith, The Nature of Sculpture. She was formerly curator of the American Federation of Arts, New York, and editor of Sculpture and Metalsmith magazines, and has contributed to numerous catalogs and publications. Jed Morse is interim director and chief curator at the Nasher Sculpture Center in Dallas. He has contributed to numerous exhibitions and publications on modern sculpture, including David Smith, drawing, and sculpting. Christopher Lyon is an independent scholar and art book publisher. His company, Lyon Artbooks, packages and co-publishes art titles, and he is currently writing a monograph on David Smith's sculpture. And our host today, critic and art historian Phyllis Tuchman, teaches and writes about art, particularly sculpture. She has taught at Williams College, Hunter College, and the School of Visual Arts, and we are lucky to have Phyllis as an editor-at-large for the Brooklyn Rail. And with that, I am going to pass it over to Phyllis to get us started.
Thank you. We're very lucky because we have a series of installation shots of the exhibition in Michigan. And let's just start with the extraordinary early work of David Smith. Now, Suzanne, why did you paint the walls green?
Okay. It was in tribute to David Smith. He talked about, and we spent quite a bit of time finding what we were calling David Smith green. He talked about acid green. He talked about like the green gases of Indiana. And we really did want to create, if not a mood, just a vibrancy. And his paint palette was so vivid. That's why we chose this green, and it's found in all three of the main galleries as an accent.
Oh, thank you.
You're
Now,
welcome.
we start with the very early objects of David Smith when he was in the Virgin Islands, and you have a snappy line that you just told us.
Right, we're looking at the gallery that is his work from the 1930s, and I think another slide will show in a minute the other wall. Yeah, if you go one more, I think. The other wall of that gallery, and we begin with his paintings because he began as a painter, right, in New York City. And he went to the Virgin Islands in 30, I believe, with Dorothy Dana. And he entered the Virgin Islands a painter and exited a sculptor because it was there that he began to construct his first 3D work.
Now, I'm going to ask a lot of questions about how much art history David Smith knew. So this very early work is on a very interesting pedestal. Was he already familiar with Brancusi?
Yes, and avowed, I mean, others can jump in because it's pretty well known, but yeah, an avowed fan of Brancusi.
It's that base does not resemble, though, any Brancusi base that one has seen. So it's I think one of the things we're looking at already there is Smith is trying to deal with the problem of how you situate the sculpture in relation to the viewer. The person he sold that to was actually someone from Michigan, Charles Palmer, who disliked the base very much and told Smith he'd like to do something different with it, but Smith would not relent.
Oh my God, the brilliance of the rounded forms and the angular base is astonishing.
Yeah.
You already see part of his brilliance early on.
Yeah.
So some of us, when we're at the beach, look for seashells. Did David Smith look for coral?
Well, yeah, if you go back one more to those very first sculptures on the right, at least of my screen, found objects. So he was working in that vein, like other artists of the period, and coral shells and stone of various organic materials. And then he ended up bringing them back to New York and continued with those materials as part of his palette, and then mixing them with industrial or manufactured materials. So this is the kind of birth of the found material or found object element in his work, and then construction and composites of various sorts. Yeah, he fell in love with those forms.
You just reminded me using found objects. I used to obsess about the definition of sculpture years and years ago when it seemed as if everyone was welding sculpture. Um, the definition of sculpture did not include welding. It was about modeling and modeling and additive sculpture. Yeah, exactly. And it's kind of astonishing in a way, carving that now so many great sculptors are now carving again. Anyway, I would just toss out the definition of sculpture. Can we have the next, please? And now, what is this kind of odd photograph?
This is a photogram that Smith made from this same piece of coral. And I suggested showing it because he's already, I think, here tussling with the problem of how to present an object as if it's released from gravity, as if it's floating in space. And later on, we'll see him in archival photographs elevating the sculpture above the base so that it seems to be floating against the sky. And this seemed to me like an interesting example of him thinking that way very, very early on. He, besides the painting and sculpture he was doing in the Virgin Islands, was quite a bit of photography. And he did some of his earliest sort of assemblages of found objects, and not sculptures, but kind of arrangements that he would photograph. And yeah, anyway.
Yeah, I would say, based on what you just said, Christopher, that his first sculptures were photographs, actually.
That's a really good point.
Wow. That's a revelation. Can we have the next, please?
So this is that same sculpture photographed on the beach near his dealer's house out on Long Island. And this is not, the one on the left is not photographed by Smith, it's Andreas Feininger. But it's interesting that already they're trying to get the sculpture as close to the horizon line as possible. In Feininger's photographs of Smith's sculpture, there are a number of them, he very prominently shows the bases. But on the photograph on the right, which is a piece called Ad Mare, it's kind of this nautical piece, Smith de-emphasizes the support so that the piece itself appears to be kind of sailing into the wind.
Christopher, you have reminded me about the horizon line and how David Smith lifts the sculptures so that they are focused against the sky. And it reminds me of how Ellsworth Kelly installed his sculpture on the Met roof. He was the only sculptor who lifted the work up so that it was not seen against any railing or whatever. And this is quite brilliant of Smith early on to understand how to photograph a sculpture.
And how to merge it with the environment, basically. I mean, it then they become one in a different way. And we'll be talking about this later, I'm sure, in the conversation, but the containment of the foreground, background, and they become unified through this type of photography and just through his forms. So
Wow, too
it's
much.
a merger.
So are these small works on the wall, are they from the disasters of war?
No,
Yeah.
no,
No.
they're from the 1950s. The ones you can see here are from the 1950s.
Yeah, and they're cast reliefs. He did make known, and this is one of the virtues or the contributions of the exhibition, is bringing these out into the light of day. Most people aren't aware of these. And 3 of 4 on the wall have botanical motifs. So rose garden or wild plum. So they were chosen for that reason. And this gallery has a lot of diversity in format and technique. There are small casts, we talked about fabrication or welding, but there are cast works in this exhibition and throughout his career. So he didn't stop casting.
And
And Jed,
were they influenced by Assyrian seals?
He was looking at those already in the 1930s before the medals for dishonor. Yeah, he was fascinated by it. He saw some of this in the British Museum, and there's a particular series of German medals that that helped that inspired the medals for dishonor. But Smith was fascinated by ancient seals.
He was like a sponge.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah. Can we have the next, please? Ay, ay, ay.
yeah. So back to found materials, back to the painting, back to relief, a lot of things.
And it's as
All
late as
there.
1958.
Mhm.
So,
And
sorry.
no, go on.
So Smith drew in a way on metal and created these astonishing images where uh, he created these astonishing images.
Yeah, drew on metal, but also with metal. Drawing
Yeah.
in space was an essential element of his sculptural vocabulary from the time that he started welding. And you always have this sense of the kind of conflict or tension between the two-dimensional and the three-dimensional in his sculptures, the kind of flat pictorial plane and the expanded three-dimensional space that extends out from there. And this is a good example of that kind of tension.
Smith also he loved to combine genres, and their head as still life. The MoMA has a wonderful example of that, and this is like a head as landscape. It's, the little figure there below, and then big star, and there's even a little cloud up at the left. So it's just this melding of seemingly incompatible subject.
Yeah, and within the exhibition, this is what I consider a proto-landscape because there is a gallery where it's entirely landscapes by title or by, form. And so this is a proto-landscape, and it also reminds us this is 45, right at the end of the war, and he comes out of the war having worked at the locomotive factory, a master welder, and he at this point can do absolutely anything with metal. And so he's like off and running post-war, and this is just a case in point because people that know their welding and their torches are really amazed at what he's achieved here with these incisions. So it's a tour de force
Yeah.
of
And
welding.
it's a night sky, isn't it?
You can definitely read it that way.
Yeah.
And Christopher, just picking up on your point of the head as landscape, the silhouette of the face on the right side of the sculpture is an element that he used in other works as well. For example, the House in a Landscape, The House of the Welder, from the same year.
Yeah.
Part of it is a kind of silhouette of a woman's face.
Mhm.
Can we have the next, please? Well, this is focused on this Vulturi. This is one of my favorite all-time sculptures. It's a head, and I've always seen it as a Brancusi-like head because of the doodad that comes out of the top of her head, as if it was a Brancusi motif. Do the rest of you see that, or am I over interpreting?
The doodad is something called a mezzaluna. It's like a
Mhm.
kitchen utensil for
Yeah, pizza.
yeah. Smith called it an antique coleslaw knife. The things extending out in the middle are brake pedals for an automobile, and of course the spine is a kind of wrench for a buggy. So it's going back to your found object thing. It's like Smith recognizing the figural possibilities in things that seem completely manufactured and utilitarian.
Yeah, and again, in the context of his career, this is the first numbered series, the Agricola, and the objects mainly coming from agricultural implements or farm tools. And the possibilities within that series they're very exciting. And earlier, Phyllis, you were just talking about the in the round encounter with a work like this. And there are, in this sculpture and most of his sculptures, I would say there are dozens of sculptures within one, because this thing, it doesn't quit. Every angle gives you a whole new composition.
Yeah, it's astonishing. I think we're going to come back to Helmholtzian landscape on the left. I think there's a better slide of it.
Yeah,
But
and you see, yeah.
in the meantime, we're going to focus on Hudson River landscape, which is the next slide. Oh, no, no. Let's go back. Okay, so Agricola one is kind of astonishing for many reasons, but I think it's very important to show how Smith created a sense of a figure in the round by that geometric shape in the back. He just needed a little reference to a sense of a body, which is kind of astonishing. And I would like to say I already described to Suzanne, Agricola there are many different theories about why he used the term Agricola. But I personally think it has to do with Giorgio Agricola, who wrote a reference book about geology very early on. He was German, even though I'm referring to him as Giorgio. And this enormous reference book on metallurgy and geology was, believe it or not, translated by Herbert Hoover. So I'm just tossing out that there are many different interpretations of why Smith used the term Agricola. Some of them tend to be about tools.
I was wondering if we could go back one to this view of the installation. Suzanne, I just wanted to say I was so impressed with this. This seems like such an astute, combination of elements. The Hudson River landscape seen through the passage into the next gallery, and then being flanked by the two of the earlier Agricolas, which actually are predicting where Smith is going from this point forward into the open-ended numbered series and a more figural direction than the lateral composition of Hudson River landscape would seem to suggest. It's an extraordinary moment, 1950, 51, and there when Smith just kind of like turns a corner and accelerates.
Do we have Hudson River landscape coming up?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so this is, Suzanne, you have so many masterpieces in this show. It's astonishing. I can't believe you were able to borrow all of this. And Hudson River landscape, always, I love riding the train through the Hudson River landscape, and you see the railroad, the rails, you see clouds, and you see steps to the water. And you even get a sense of water flow in that extraordinary horizontal line. One thing that cannot be disputed, David Smith had an amazing imagination, and he had the ability to realize what he pictured. So
a couple of things. Can we go back one slide to get this in context? And then I'm going to invite Jed, who has an essay in the catalog, and there is an exhibition catalog, everyone out there, that you can enjoy. And because Jed's essay focuses a lot on this, so he can riff a bit.
Yeah, and I don't know what you all think, but the theme of landscape is not something that many sculptors ever have tried to tackle. It's almost unique to David Smith. There are I can think of a couple of examples among his contemporaries that that deal with landscape in any kind of significant way, but they tend to be one-offs or departures, brief departures from something else that they're interested in. But David Smith, of course, over a period of about 10 years in the 1940s mostly, and ending really with a couple of works, including this one in the early 50s, really focused on landscape as a theme for sculpture. None of them are literal. He talks about the creation of this sculpture in a lecture that he gave a little bit later. in Michigan, actually, and in Detroit, and talks about it being the result of many trips up and down the Hudson on the train, and but then talks about, as he's drawing from the memory of these trips, he spills his ink bottle onto his hand, and that ink blot starts to make him think of not only the landscape that he had experienced, but other landscapes, and goes on this kind of stream of consciousness description of how he arrived at the sculpture. And so, it is much more fanciful and dreamlike than literal, although we can, interpret various elements of it as parts of the landscape or parts of that experience of moving up and down the Hudson on the train. And of course, the land that he's moving through, the Hudson River, is a significant landscape, for a number of reasons, particularly to American art, in that it's the home of the Hudson River School of 19th century American landscape painters. And so what Suzanne was referring to, my essay in the catalog, has to do with, the relationship between Smith's work, a mid 20th century sculptor, and the work of, the kind of father and premier acolyte of the 19th century American landscape painting, Thomas Cole and Frederick Church, who had homes that occupied either side of the Hudson, and that Smith passed by every time he took the train. So even though Smith never really talks about American landscape painting at all in any of his writings and any of his recorded lectures, there are really interesting parallels in terms of the 19th century landscape painters' experience of the landscape and what it meant to them in the 19th century, and Smith's experience of landscape and what the landscape meant to him. And so it's kind of a fanciful diversion on my part to explore that a little bit more in depth. But the landscape here is used as this kind of this space of freedom, a space that is one of liberty and release for David Smith, and rather than being kind of related to Manifest Destiny, American monuments, a sense of the sublime and the presence of God, as it was for 19th century American landscape painters. For David Smith, the landscape was more about a kind of very 20th century concept of the freedom of the imagination, the connection with nature, with life, and being part of that life, and something that for him was not connected to God, and especially not to the church, maybe to God, but more to a sense of spirituality, of being fulfilled by nature and in nature, and having it be kind of a space outside of society, a space of freedom.
Wow, Jed, I can't wait to read your essay.
Thanks, Phyllis.
Oh my God. And I'm so, I haven't looked at at David Smith's photographs in a very, very long time. But again, he's lifted up this sculpture so you see the main elements. It's brilliant.
Always silhouetted against the sky.
Yeah, it's like a lesson in how to photograph sculpture.
Right. And back to the containing of the background in the sculpture itself. So it becomes part of the composition, basically.
Right. So to me, he's using nature in two ways here. One, just as you just said, he's containing the sky within this. What Edward Fry talked about, the painterly frames that Smith imported from painting into sculpture. And this is a really good example. And in your installation, Suzanne, you've got Helmholtzian landscape close enough to this that you can actually see them both together, and it really reinforces that. And then the other thing nature is doing here is providing a support for the composition, and it almost follows the landscape like with uncanny precision. So it's really fascinating.
This reminds me that early on, before he had a chance to visit Europe himself, he was learning of modernism through mostly through periodicals, but also through his teachers at the Art Students League, Jan Matulka in particular, and he would have his photographs actually remind me a lot of say Henry Moore's photographs of his sculptures early on that were often small in scale, but kind of photographed from a low position silhouetted against the sky, so you could get a sense of the form. But also oftentimes there wasn't any reference to scale, so you can imagine the sculpture being either very small or very large. You just have no sense of how big that thing really is.
Wow. Can we have the next, please?
Yeah.
Thank you, Jed.
Yeah, you're welcome.
It's from the Nasher, everyone.
Yeah. So this is done in 1950, kind of towards the end of when he's making landscape sculptures. And I love these kinds of tools that he's used to create the trees. And this also is a good kind of proto Agricola in that sense, in that he's using these old farm implements to create the sculpture. One of the things that this work and these works in general reminds me of is the pictorialism. These are all kind of squared compositions, oftentimes framed in some way. This one not in particular. And so there's the sense of looking at a picture, but it extends out from there. And you have this kind of wonderful eccentric figure of this kind of line or rod that runs up into the trees, with this head kind of extended up into the trees away from the body, as if it's in this kind of place of reverie in the forest, which I think was indicative of the way that Smith himself experienced nature.
The other thing that's so interesting to me about this piece and 3 or 4 others right around that period are assemblies of similar elements on a shared base that seem to predict what we're looking at, what we were looking at just a moment ago, which is the installations in the South Field, where none of these is more important than another. What's going on is about the relationships, the complex relationships of them, and they become like, I keep thinking of that old surrealist phrase, a magnetic field. So
I'm always struck by the stainless steel and how it is so animate. I used to see the stainless steel piece in Princeton, and in the daytime it's one thing, at nighttime it's another, in the rain it's another. And David Smith really lived with these sculptures, and he knew the ins and outs of how stainless steel reflected the world around them and how they became animated.
Yeah, I call stainless steel his magic metal, which may not be true, but it worked that way because he did extract all kinds of magical effects. These burnished surfaces end up having great depth. I'm sure we've all seen them in different contexts, and it almost becomes holographic in its kind of weird refraction and blurriness of surface. And that work on the right, the Sentinel, is in the exhibition, the outdoor aspect or dimension of our exhibition. So there's a lot going on with that material.
When I first heard about David Smith and stainless steel, which was many, many, many years ago, it was about the difficulty of welding and cutting stainless steel. Is that true?
Yeah, I mean, stainless steel is
Yeah.
very difficult to work. It is, one of the hardest metals, and it takes. I mean, it takes a lot of skill, particularly if you're, if you are, trying to make very clean, precise cuts and welds, and then if you want to polish it, then that takes a lot of really arduous effort.
It is the case, though, that at least for the cubis, Smith would order boxes tack welded together that could be assembled. So it's not that every single angle that you see is cut.
And I'm loving the fantasy images here, and dead center. I mean, come on, that's like a robotic figure. There's a head, a torso, and legs. The man had an immense imagination.
I mean, I think the fields are an incredibly important landmark, no pun intended, in sculpture. It was a generative and very radical way of experiencing and thinking about the relationship between sculpture and the landscape, which was, coming to the fore at that moment in art. But this particular installation, the relationship between the sculptures and the setting, and the kind of variability of it, is something that was, I think, incredibly radical, and also I think was generative for Smith. And then in particular with the relationship to the landscape, and I think it's an important precursor for larger installations in the landscape, like that we see in land art.
Mm-hmm. And even it was suggested, and I completely own this here at Meyer Gardens and Sculpture Park, that the roots of the modern or contemporary sculpture park were laid here in his installations and compositions outdoors, just the spread and the different possibilities. And so he can be considered the father of the sculpture park.
And
13 or 14 of the pieces from this were actually bought for Storm King in, I think, 1967, and
Yeah.
it's sort of the core of their outdoor collection.
I feel that they talked to him. He didn't live by himself, that he he had this immense population here, and one of my favorite images is the hero, which is in the Brooklyn Museum, and there is a face on one side of the top element, and Smith put it by the door, and it was as if the hero was greeting him when he came home.
What are our next slides? Because we might, I want to be reminded. No, okay, because when we get to the ravens, we can bring this
Totally.
topic of company and who did he keep company with and all of that. So
Yeah.
that's later. Oh, okay. I don't know. It's up to you, Phyllis, if we're done with the landscape room or not.
Oh, but the ravens are part of the landscape.
True.
Yeah.
Yeah. So just setting the stage here, another series, The Ravens. He did 7. We have 3. The one in the distance is flock raven. So the ability to capture this dispersion of birds and motion. And I've done these like not proto, but they're futurist, if nothing else. They have all the dynamism and all the speed and all of the elements that the futurists were seeking. And he did this. So series of ravens, and then Against the Green Wall, it's 4 from a really large selection of drawings and studies of flight and patterns, flight patterns of either insects or birds. So this is to make the point that he really, really was attentive to all the life around him to be able to capture it this way. But through these drawings, these were what they were, studies. And he was keeping company with not just the elements, but the life around him. And the raven, of course, being a major resident of the Adirondacks.
Can we have the next one? Because yeah. Okay. So does the raven also allude to Edgar Allan Poe?
I don't think so. You know, the odd thing is these sculptures, which look pretty abstract, are almost exactly the size of actual ravens. I mean, I think he's really responding to the natural world here and very directly.
They're wonderful. And I think that sense of futurism that you just mentioned, Suzanne, I've never thought about it. It's incredible.
That's the joy of living with these for months now, that you get to revisit and rethink, and takes a while sometimes.
Thank you. Can we have here are some more ravens.
It's just a frontal view.
Can we have the next, please?
So Jed, you asked about these aerial photographs. I more or less randomly picked a couple. I'm so curious to hear your thoughts about them.
Yeah, Smith took these photographs, from his seat in an airplane flying over the landscape, and talked about how how all of the details of the landscape are subsumed within a pictorial plane. It flattens, obviously the camera flattens everything out, but even that aerial view flattens everything out. And, this is, if you think about the landscape sculptures that he makes and how they reference the pictorial field, these kind of photographs kind of underline that sense of the pictorial, where vast expanse is contained within, a kind of a flattened plane. It seemed to really, I think, underline how that the tension that we pick up in a lot of Smith's sculptures of that tension between 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions, is manifest in his own experience of, not here, the landscape, but also, his visual experience and, perception and visual experience was something that he was very interested in. We didn't talk about the Helmholtzian landscape before, but, that's all about, it's all about color theory and perception. And then he did another landscape that was, that referenced, the cones and rods in one's eye. And so, those sculptures in particular are thinking about how one perceives landscape. And, these photographs are kind of, wonderful documents of that experience, David Smith's experience of landscape.
And pre-drone.
That's right. Yeah.
So many TV shows now use drones to photograph from above. This is kind of astonishing.
Yeah, that ability to see the sculpture, his own work, and then provide that experience for us, from not just 360 degrees. I don't know if you can add more than 360 degrees to something, but to see it from above, to see it from all around when it's often composed flat on the ground, right? As it's being welded, or even if it's composed upright, he can pre-see all of these different angles and all of these different possibilities of form that are built into the work, including from above, I guess you could say, in a case like this.
It's astonishing.
So it goes beyond just what you're saying, Phyllis, that he had great imagination. He had great supersonic, well, it's blending sound and vision, but supersonic abilities to perceive form from all directions and dimensions.
This often repeated quote by Smith, when I'm in my shop, I see the clouds. When I'm in the clouds, I'm there to look at my work. This somehow this psychic ability to be both, above and in the work is really kind of amazing. This photograph was taken by Dan Budnick a couple of years after Smith died, but where the work was still mostly in the fields. And
that's the studio, isn't it?
No, that's the house. The studio would be down to the bottom right of the photograph. You can't see it here.
Wow. Can we have the next, please?
So we're entering, yeah.
I think these 2 sculptures were at Hauser and Wirth last winter.
Yes, they were.
And how do we feel about their color? I mean, the way Smith painted the sculpture became controversial when Clement Greenberg tried to remove it. But how do we feel?
I think you have to, first of all, distinguish between color and paint. Paint had this other function in the Adirondacks of protecting the work against the weather. It was really Rosalind Krauss that first sort of made this distinction when she, wrote the famous article attacking Greenberg for allowing the work to deteriorate in the fields. But I think that's an important distinction. Smith's engagement with color was always a challenge for him, and he said as much in this long interview with Tom Hess in the 60s. But he also said that, these attempts, whether they're successful or not, are really important to him. So, you it's a challenge to judge them because some of them seem to work well and some seem like, really?
Right. And we can't see the other side of the Rebecca circle, the one with the black that looks like a flower. And that is, every time you see it, it's kind of shocking and almost laughable, wonderfully laughable. So we can't see that. I think we have another slide though of these two. Oh, right, there you go, from just a more direct visual. And what I like to remind visitors here in a sculpture park that, oh, there you go. Again, we're not seeing the other side, but just the fact that it was painted metal for us, it's kind of a given. Okay, we're surrounded by painted metal, painted steel. But at the time, it was disturbing even. It just was wrong for so many viewers and appreciators of art. So that's something to keep in mind. Today, it's no big deal to have a bright yellow vertical sculpture, but it was a big deal.
It was totally
Mhm.
and very gutsy,
Mhm.
especially out in a green landscape.
Yeah.
One of the things about the Rebecca Circle painting that just struck me looking at it in your installation was how it evokes Picasso's images of his daughter. This kind of like just gay, kind of like a child lifting a leg. It's so happy. It's such a
Well,
such a happy sculpture.
you cued me to make another point that I try to emphasize or have emphasized in the catalog and in the exhibition, which is the devotion to Rebecca and Candida and the declarative nature of many of his works having their names in the title. And that joy factor that you're noting is part of that as well. So the other one, Dita Circle. So these two flower-like forms are tied to his two daughters. And I declared him the most one of the greatest father artists in the history of art.
Yeah, you could say that. It's
Hmm.
kind of astonishing.
Hmm.
Can we have the next, please? Well, here are the incredible cube eyes. Some seem to be figures and some seem to be giant heads. Um, what do you, what do the rest of you think? They're figures of sorts.
Can you go to the next? 'Cause we have another shot of this in situ. Right. This is on the rooftop outside of that glass wall gallery we just saw. Just to put it again in context, and there's another of his works in the background. So,
I think that this, you could see this as the void in the center of this work as one of those pictorial frames with an eccentric, geometric element. There's another view of this too, I think, below. What's fascinating to me is how he gets the facets to be dark and light, back and forth. It's constantly changing when you look at it.
Do
yeah,
we have
back to the stainless
a
steel.
cube eye? Is
Oh,
yeah.
there it is. The one on, this is what I was thinking about, the one on the right there, which is photographed on Smith's property, 1963. And he both the color and the black and white one are kind of interesting because he incorporates a nearby shrub tree in each one that the piece is nicely contrasted with its hard edges.
Can we have the next, please?
Yeah, Primo Piano 2. So there are 4 outdoor sculptures, as I said, as a complement, because it's crucial to this engagement with nature. And we have a rooftop to allow for that installation. And this one, reinforcing what Christopher said about the framing and the oculus even, or the viewfinder, in the center of that teardrop form is a circle, is a hole, and the way it not only frames the surroundings that when you look through it, but there becomes this almost warped lens-like effect in how it recreates the scene that you're looking at. So this is, for me, one of the most explicit instances of giving you a viewfinding hole to use to see your surroundings.
That kind of reminds me of the zig that's in Philharmonic Hall. The zig is quite brilliant because David Smith bore a hole so that the water would not collect. He lovingly rethought all of those details. The other thing that's interesting is these curved elements on the left, the white part, because I mentioned in an article I wrote in 1973 that they were actually used to move snow in trucks. I'm just forgetting the word for
snowplow.
Snowplows, yeah. And
Mhm.
they're snowplow elements.
Mhm. You know, in looking at this, I'm reminded of another lovely exhibition that took place recently at Storm King of the black and white, David Smith's black and white works, and thinking about the function of paint in some of his works, particularly work like Primo Piano 2 here, but also some of those black and white works, is, how they affect your perception of the form. There's this sense of kind of accentuating, a bit like the light and shadow on the facets of the cubi and in the photos that we were looking at earlier, particularly the black and white photos. That sense of contrasting solid and void, and presence and absence, and these seem to kind of having this kind of stark contrast between white and then dark as has a significant effect on how you perceive the presence or the depth of the composition from one particular place. And I'm just kind of theorizing about this right now, but and then the others, works that have kind of more vibrant color on them, I'm not sure how that fits in, but it could be perceptual, because that was such an important, it was such an interest of Smith's, for a long time.
Yeah,
There's something else going on here that I'm not sure will be evident, or I'm not sure I'm even correct in perceiving it, but Smith early in his career did a lot of reclining figures. It was like his favorite mode for in the mid 1930s. And I just realized that this thing could be read as a reclining figure with the head on the right and a leg extending up on the left.
Yeah. And he did a number of drawings that kind of elide this idea of a reclining figure in the landscape. You can read it as one or the other, or as both, and they're essentially just abstract ink drawings, which are really lovely. But that sense that the landscape is as a body, or the body as a landscape.
Helen,
and that
sorry. Please.
No, that's okay. I was just going to say that it's reclining in a way, and the way it occupies space. And if we could just go back for one moment to that piece, because we're not only talking about contrast of color and light and dark. This has 3 different metals. So you have bronze, steel, and stainless steel. And I have to do a shout out to that angled panel at the top, which is a burnished stainless steel slab angled directly to the sky, to the sun, and it is nothing less than a solar panel. And that's the way it reads. And he has combined various series. So this is 62. He's come back from Voltri, and then you get a bit of the zig, like you said, Phyllis. You get some of the cubi in there. It's a composite of materials, series, strategies even. It's very rich.
Oh my God, you just made it even a better sculpture than I thought it was. Thank
Well,
you.
again, I get to live with it. So
That's what David Smith did. He lived with them.
mhm.
Can we have the next, please? I've always seen this as a giant bird.
Like an Ernst bird.
Mhm.
Wow. Yeah.
Sentinel.
Mhm.
Okay, the next one is one of David Smith's masterpieces. Do you all agree?
Totally. Yep.
And how did he bend that steel?
He
Exactly.
didn't. It was a mistake in the foundry. It came off a roller, and he talked about it turning itself in like a stick of gum, and he, just loved it because he made it into this piece
It's one of the great figurative sculptures of all time.
for sure.
Yeah. And the head, the head is astonishing. And this big torso. The Vultures are just incredibly inventive.
Yeah.
So down at the bottom right, you can see that piece. Moulas must have had some very powerful spotlights on these things, so that he could photograph at night.
Can we have the next, please?
There.
Yeah, we never got to Helmholtzian landscape. The next, please.
I think that's it.
Mhm.
I think.
Oh, we just never got to Helmholtzian
We
landscape.
could zoom back.
We could scroll back to it.
It's one of
There it is.
yeah, there it is. It's one of the most inventive sculptures, with a title like Helmholtzian landscape, reminding you of Helmholtz, but also, in my 1973 article, I identified this as a very much line for line copy of an Yves Tanguy, and you don't expect to relate David Smith to Yves Tanguy.
It's painting and sculpture both at a high pitch,
It's astonishing, and you
and
feel
theater.
vibrancy of the yellow as a sun, and it goes back to your green of your walls, the landscape, and that figure on the right. Oh my God. And then it seems to almost be nautical.
This was the one colored sculpture by Smith that Greenberg approved of.
No kidding.
Oh, that's a relief.
Right.
Should we
No,
open?
because
Yeah, sorry.
it was about color, I guess. So it was okay. It was about color by its very nature.
Yep.
Should we open up to questions?
Mhm.
Yes. I have a few questions from the audience, and before I ask them, I just want to thank you all so much for this incredibly luminous conversation. It's been a pleasure to listen to.
Oh my God, I learned so much.
If anyone has a question, there's a form in the chat where you can submit them to us, and we would love to ask your questions. Someone did ask a question, an anonymous audience member, about the undulating horizontal curves of Hudson River landscape and whether they're informed by the profiles of New York mountains. And I'm curious to hear you all speak on that.
I'm sorry, the profiles of New York
Mountains.
mountains. Oh,
I don't think he was that literal, personally.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, he tended to be, I think, much more kind of free form, particularly with that work. It would be that would be a fun assignment to, go through the landscape and see if you can, assign, a particular mountainside to it. That would be lovely. Sounds like a good fall or spring field trip.
Absolutely.
Someone else in the audience asks if the ground marks on the QB series are physical equivalents to the stumbled paint surfaces of his earlier works.
Good question.
that's an interesting question. He wrote that the burnishing of those surfaces had no particular, significance. What that says about the scumbling of the paint, I don't know, but that is what he said about the burnishing.
But it did catch light, so it had a function, but maybe no direct association, because that was
It
like,
wasn't meant to be expressive, is I guess what I'm saying.
right, yeah, in and of itself as a gesture or a mark, right?
Right.
It was an abstraction. We always forget that he made abstract art.
I'm curious. I have a question for you about David Smith's interest in nature and how much of it, and it could be both of these things, but I'm intrigued by his use of materials and how they very much reflect the time in which he was working, in which cities were building up and steel towers were going up, and how those same materials then become a way to connect back to Earth. And there's much about his work that feels to serve as a reminder that those materials come from Earth and are part of Earth as much as we are. And I wonder how much of his intrigue with nature felt reactionary to what was happening at the time in which he was working, and how much of it was intuitive and part of his life and something that he was always going to do.
Well, there's a thought, and I have to say I owe this to Irving Sandler, an old friend of the Rail. But in his memoir of Smith, in the catalog for the 3-part show at Storm King that Candida co-organized, Irving ends it by mentioning Leo Marx's book, classic book, The Machine in the Garden, and he suggests that, I hope you don't mind, I'll just read this passage because I think it's very suggestive, and we all remember Irving very well. He wrote, "It was as if Smith tried to reconcile the two antithetical visions that Leo Marx defined in his book, The Machine in the Garden. On the one hand, the idealized belief in America as a new Eden in which inhabitants would lead a simpler life closer to nature, as evoked in the writings of Cooper, Thoreau, Melville, Frost, and Hemingway. And on the other hand, the regard for industrial might, which has had an equally powerful hold on the American consciousness." And what that suggests is that, the Bolton fields were not raw nature on the one hand, and they weren't in industry on the other. They're a kind of intermediate space, a kind of pastoral setting where you can imagine Smith is intuitively or intentionally or whatever trying to reconcile these really tough opposites in the American consciousness that so many writers and artists in the 19th century also wrestled with.
Yeah, so I'm gonna add like a couple angles to that question. The both there's both everywhere in his work, and the seemingly antitheticals are brought together again and again across time in his career. And part of what this exhibition does is serve as a counterpoint to the heavy industrial reading and reception and contextualization of his work. So I think it gives you that counterbalance that was needed to fully appreciate what he was doing. So that's one thing. And the other, the largest trajectory or the narrative for this exhibition and maybe for his career is with those found objects from nature, the corals and the stones and the shells. It was an act of taking nature and transplanting it into art. And at the end of his career, toward the end of the career, it's about taking the art and transplanting it or returning it back to nature. So it's literally like a give and take where the materials of the natural materials are co-opted for art, and then art is brought back into the natural fold. So there are a lot of ways of saying what you just said, Christopher, in that he has both, he has it all. And that's probably why we're so excited by the work, because it's all there.
There's also he talked quite a bit about he can't separate himself from nature because he's a part of nature, and that, what humans do is therefore a part of nature. And I think that maybe one of the ways that he reconciled, that kind of sense of the industrial and the natural, and that this is a sincere product of, human experience, and which is kind of a beautiful, when you see all of those works in the fields, I love that sense of, these kind of seemingly industrial things being returned to nature.
Mm.
Yeah.
There was one film many, many years ago. I think I was still in high school. And it was a TV film, and David Smith had moved the scrap so that it was like he was tidying up the field. And it was kind of astonishing that he was tidying up the field.
Hmm.
Yeah, I've never forgotten it.
I love that. Thank you all so much for those answers. I think that's going to conclude our Q&A today, unless you have any questions for each other, which I want to make sure we have room for.
Oh my God. I want to thank everybody. I learned so much.
Thank you, Phyllis, for leading us through this.
Yeah, it was a pleasure.
And
Oh,
Chris, do you want to
good
close
stuff.
us out? Christopher, do you have a reading to close us out today?
Oh, a short one, yes. This is Robert Motherwell on Smith in 1950, and still maybe one of the best things that has been written about him. And Candida included it in her introduction to your current catalog. Sorry, Suzanne. He wrote, "When I saw that David places his work against the mountains and sky, the impulse was plain, an ineffable desire to see his humanness related to exterior reality, to nature at least, if not man, for the marvel of the felt scale that exists between a true work and the immovable world, that relation that makes both human."
Perfect.
Wow. That was such a beautiful way to end. Thank you so much for reading that. And thank you again, Phyllis. Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you, Christopher. Thank you, Jed, for this really wonderful conversation today. Thank you as well to Luke and to the team at the estate for all of your support in preparing for today. And
Yes.
especially to Frederick Meyer Sculpture Garden for all of those beautiful photographs that we were able to look at today, and Chris, who provided many of those photographs from the archives as well. And I would also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art, who sponsor the New Social Environment and make weekday conversations like this one possible. They also support our archive, where this will view shortly. The Rail has been free and independent for 24 years. A donation directly supports our work. I encourage you to do so through the link in the chat if you can. And if you are free on Monday at 1 p.m., please do join us for a conversation featuring artists Enzo Camacho and Amy Lien in conversation with CJ Salapare on the occasion of their exhibition Offerings for Escalante on view at MoMA PS1 in New York. And as is Rail tradition, you all can now turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you so, so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you so
Thank
much.
you,
Thanks for
everybody.
joining us.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Thank you, Phyllis. Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Suzanne. Thanks, Christopher.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Jed.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so,
Very
so
well.
much. And go see the show. And good
Yeah.
graphics.
Yes.
You're here.
Bye, everybody.
You'll have a good time, I promise.
It looks great.
Bye, everyone. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.